Let's talk now about array mesh. Array mesh is essentially an instancing tool. It allows you to create copies of a piece of geometry along a path and then duplicate and manipulate those in terms of their rotation, scale, and offset, as well as their pivot. So you find array mesh under the tool menu. If you go to tool, you see that array mesh is located here. We turn on array mesh just by turning on the array mesh button, and then we can turn on transpose. Press W to bring up transpose move and turn off the gizmo, and now you see we have the transpose line. I'll snap it to the y-axis, and you see it has stage and repeat. So this is new. This comes through array mesh. If I take this transpose line and then just move the object up, you see it creates a copy. Now I can change my repeats by changing the slider here, or I can click and drag here to change my repeats along that path, like so. Now we want this to spiral like a spiral staircase, so we'll come over here to rotate. We'll go to the Y amount and rotate it around 360 degrees. And now you see it's starting to rotate, but it's not rotating around that central pillar. So snap to a top view, and we'll change the pivot. So now I can adjust the pivot. If I click and drag, it will snap the pivot to degrees, or to units, I should say. Take my Z direction, and let's adjust this pivot. So I just want to snap that pivot around to the center. Let's get that just right. Let's come around here so we can see our central point that we're aiming for. So we're pretty good in X. So we just want to take Z and adjust Z and get it right about there. There we go. So now you see it's rotating around that central pillar. If I increase my repeats, I get more copies. If I reduce them, I get fewer. That is array mesh in its simplest form. It takes an object, instances along a path, and then you can manipulate those instances. So let's take a look now at a different model. Here I have an object that I created using ZModeler. It's just a very simple box model. You see it's got polygrouping. Now what we want to do is we want to make a circle out of this. Now I could go into my Lightbox array presets and actually find a preset for this. And this is a great way to learn array mesh because you can open these up and see how these different pieces have been created. But we're going to do this manually. I am going to turn on array mesh. I'm going to go to rotate. I'm going to rotate it around X 360 degrees. I will turn up my copies, and as I do that, turn up my repeats. You see it increases along the length. Now I will go to pivot, and we want to change the pivot of that rotation around the y-axis. So we'll make that, let's try 2.01. That's pretty good. Let's go ahead and increase that a bit so we get a larger circle. We can increase our numbers and then increase our circle. Now, here we've got this nice circular form created from this simple object. Now, this is very, very cool. Because I've got polygrouping here, and the polygroups match on each end, if I turn on extrude and then click make mesh, what this will do is it will bake down the array mesh into a model, but it will extrude those faces. But you see, it doesn't complete the chain. So let's undo that, turn on close, and then make mesh. Now that makes an actual closed 3D object. So this is a great way to make cogs or wheels or any type of object that you could imagine. You can merge them together with extrusions, which is extremely handy. So let's take a look now at another thing that we can do with array mesh. I'm going to open up a model that I used in the cover image for this video series, a little section of human spine. So here we have a single vertebrae. I will turn on array mesh and I will turn on transpose. Go to W and remember to turn off the gizmo if you don't see the transpose line. I will increase my distance and then I will turn up my repeats. Now I'll take rotate. Now let's rotate this around. Let's look at our axis here. So let's rotate this around the Z axis. Now let's go ahead and do the X axis. That'll probably be better. There we go. So I can rotate that around the X axis. I can take my pivot. Well, let's go back and let's actually really turn this up. Let's do this to 180 degrees. There we are. Now I'll take my pivot and I will adjust my pivot. So if I take my pivot and I move it in the Y direction, you can see the effect that that has. Move it the opposite way in the Y direction, you can see the effect that that has. Take the Z direction, and we start to get this interesting sort of whipping shape here. So I think this is quite neat. You might recognize the shape that we're creating if you look at the cover image. I made these tentacles out of vertebrae, and this is how those were created. So let's go to scale, and I would like this to scale as we go down the various axes. So we'll take, let's see, let's scale it in X and scale it in Y. Let's do 0.44 and 0.44 and take Z 0.44. There we go. So now that's scaling down quite a bit. Let's go ahead and increase our repeats along that distance. Now let's go to our pivot and let's change that pivot further. Y isn't going to have much of an effect, but we can change it in the Z axis like this. And let's see, let's go ahead and open up our Z profile. Now watch what happens if we change the profile curve. We can change the character of that swoop. So I want that to be more gradual like this. So there you see the effect that that gives us. Let's go to scale and let's adjust the scale profile here. I want it to be quite big and then suddenly get smaller. Now I can copy this curve, and there's a little close button there. If I close that and then open up the next curve, I can paste, close that curve, open up this one, and paste. And then that will take that and place it on that transform on each one of those instances. Let's go back to pivot, take that, and I think I'm going to adjust that again. And I'm going to bring this down a little bit. There we go. Now I want to go to rotation. So we already have a rotation in the X amount. If I were to change the rotation in the Z amount, you can see that we start getting this interesting twisting, like so. And that's quite a nice looking effect there. It gets a very interesting repetition. I can align to path, and if I turn on align to path, it locks those objects to the path. So it starts to take on almost like a centipedal shape. Turn my repeats up, and there we go. So there's no limit to sort of the very interesting and unusual shapes we can create this way. Now I can add another stage to this array. So if I go to stage 2, I want to go over here and I want to click append new, turn on chain, and then that snaps that new instance to the end of the chain. So watch what happens now. If I go to offset, and maybe let's offset this in the Y direction, and let's give it a little bit of offset in X. And let's turn up our repeats. See that that's carrying on from there. I can go to my pivot. Now, if I want, I can actually select the pivot directly and move that pivot over here. Go to rotate, and let's rotate around the Y amount. Oops, that's a bit much. There we go. So now we get this really nice spiral, but it doesn't blend into the original very well. That's why we have the smooth slider. If I turn the smooth slider up, look what that does. It just beautifully transitions into that other shape. And now you see I've got 2 stages here. I can go to stage 1 and it grays out stage 2. Come back down here where I can actually see the stage, go to stage 2, and it will gray out stage 1. I can also select my stages here with the transform stage. Now, let's take a look at how we can use array mesh to create a nanomesh. Now, why would we want to do that? If you haven't watched the nanomesh video yet, nanomesh is a way of taking a mesh and distributing it along faces of a model. Where array mesh is very procedural and parametric, it gives you smooth transitions between shapes. Nanomesh allows you to introduce randomness. So to do this, I'm going to open up a different model. We're going to make another wall of skulls, but this time we're going to create it using array mesh and then manipulate it using nanomesh. So here I have a decimated version of a human skull model. You see it's quite low res. You can decimate your array mesh base models, and depending on how many instances you plan on making, it's probably a good idea. Because if you have a million polygon mesh and then you create instances along a curve of those and turn that into a mesh, you're going to end up with something very, very dense. So we're going to go ahead and take this, and I'll go to array mesh, and this time I will use my presets. There's two different brick walls here. There is a brick wall where everything's stacked up evenly, and then a brick wall where everything's offset. So I'll open up the offset wall, and here you see we've got this wall of skulls. This has multiple stages. If I go to stage 3 and then change my repeats, you see I've got a various number of repeats here. If I go to offset, I can change my offset on that. Let's change that down to 3. Go to our second stage and let's go to offset and increase the offset between those. Go to stage 1 and that'll just be the first one, so that's fine. So stage 2 and then stage 3, I want to change my offset to bring this down closer to the other bit of skulls here. And then I'll go to stage 1 again, and I think I'll turn my repeats down so there's not quite so many. So there we go. We have a wall of skulls that are offset, but we have no way to introduce any kind of randomness to it. However, if I click Convert to Nanomesh, what that does is it creates a polygon plane for each one of those skulls and converts that skull into a nanomesh. So now if I go to the Nanomesh menu, and if you haven't watched the video yet on Nanomesh, I encourage you to do that because we go into this in much more depth. Here I can control the parameters of each one of these instances. I can change their global sizing. I can go to the offset and change their Z offset. So maybe I want to sink those skulls into the wall a little bit. And then I will turn the variation slider up. So that makes some skulls sink in deeper and some stick out further. So you're starting to see the value of this. We can create randomness here. Let's go to our rotation. Let's change the Y rotation. And then let's introduce a randomness to Y. So now the skulls all rotate in a different direction around Y. We can do the same thing for X. And we can do the same thing for Z. So now you see we've created a whole bunch of randomness in that wall of skulls. Now this is, again, essentially instancing. These are nanomeshes, so it's not as memory intensive as having all of these individual skulls. If I do want to turn this into an actual mesh, I'll go to Inventory and click 1 to Mesh, and that converts all of those into an actual Z tool. So I can Control-Shift-Click on the underlying plane to hide it, and then go to Geometry, Modify Topology, and click Delete Hidden. So now that deletes those helper planes, and we just have the skulls. So that is converting array mesh to a nanomesh. Hopefully you found this tutorial helpful. I think that array mesh is a wonderful tool that does great work for architectural pieces and organics. But before we close, there is one more thing I want to show you. Here is how we can create organics using array mesh. So if we go to this subtool here and open up array mesh, you see I've actually got an array mesh set up here. I just have a single stage with 11 repeats, and I'm rotating it around the y-axis. If we go into frame mode, you can see this is just a very, very simple object that I created using ZModeler. Now, this has polygrouping. Now remember that we can extrude along the polygroup. So watch what happens when I take this simple object, come down here to array mesh, oops, yeah, there we go, come to array mesh, turn on extrude, turn on close, and then make mesh. Now that turns that into a mesh, and because we've got that polygrouping, it's creating negative spaces in there. So watch what happens when I divide this. I end up with this really beautiful organic form. So that's a wonderful type of sort of alien tentacle or whip, just something that you can create that's organic using array mesh. So don't think that it's only for hard surface. We can actually do organics with this as well if you're creative and you think your way around a solution. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and you find array mesh helpful and you can start to incorporate it into your own workflow. And I will see you in the next video.